The wind off the Black Sea howled like a restless beast, tearing white foam from the waves and hurling it against the wooden pier. The air was thick with salt, smoke, and the sharp stench of fish, a scent that stung the lungs more than it welcomed them. Into this raw place stepped Katya Belova. She climbed down from the rattling carriage, her boots sinking into the wet mud. The young doctor, fresh from the lecture halls of St. Petersburg, looks like a misplaced piece of glass among rough stone. Her wool coat was clean, her satchel polished, but her eyes, steady, analytical, belonged to someone who had already stared illness and death in the face. The villagers turned to look, some curious, some suspicious. In Berezhny, strangers were measured in silence, like dangerous cargo brought in on a storm tide. On the pier, men hauled grates from a boat, grunting under the weight. One man stood out immediately. Tall, broad-shouldered, movements sure and commanding. He lifted the grates with ease, his voice cutting across the noise, every order obeyed without hesitation. When a grate slipped, he caught it mid-fall, quick, precise, then looked up. And for a heartbeat, their eyes met. Hers sharp, questioning, his unreadable, carrying the cold weight of secrets. A fisherman at Katya's side muttered almost reverently, "Nikolai Sokolov. The sea belongs to him, and they say more than the sea." Katya's lips parted, but before she could ask, a harsh, ragged cough split the air. Near the cluster of cottages, an old woman collapsed to her knees, clutching her chest. Without hesitation, Katya crossed the mud, her satchel snapping open in her hands. She knelt, steady and focused, her tools glinting in the thin autumn light. The villagers circled, silent, their eyes wary, testing her, weighing her. The sea roared behind them, carrying with it the scent of brine and blood, and from the pier, Nikolai's gaze lingered, fixed on the stranger who had come to mend the sick, as if he already knew she was stepping into currents far darker than she imagined. Morning broke over Berezhny, with a pale, watery sun that did little to warm the damp air. The village stirred slowly, smoke rising from chimneys, nets being dragged to the shore, gulls screaming above the tide. For the locals, it was routine. For Katya Belova, it was her first full day inside their guarded world. She walked the narrow lanes with her satchel at her side, taking in the faces that watched from doorways and half-shuttered windows. Suspicion weighed heavier than the sea wind. Children whispered and darted behind corners. Mothers pulled them back, as if the doctor carried not cures, but curses. Katya stopped at a cottage where she'd been told an illness lingered. A fisherman's wife, hollow-eyed and trembling with fever, lay on a straw mattress. The small room smelled of damp earth and unwashed linen. Katya unpacked her instruments, her calm voice cutting through the silence. "Water first, then rest. Keep the air moving. This is not a curse," she said firmly when the old grandmother muttered prayers against evil spirits. "It is sickness, and it can be fought." Her tone silenced the room, but the mistrust didn't leave. The family obeyed, reluctantly, as though the cure might bring worse than the disease. When Katya stepped back outside, she found him there. Nikolai Sokolov leaned against a fence post, arms folded, eyes sharp beneath the shadow of his brow. He had watched her without announcing himself, like a man who preferred to observe before deciding if something, or someone, was worth his time. "You speak with confidence," he said at last, his voice carrying the gravel of the sea. "But confidence won't make them trust you. Around here, trust is earned." Katya's chin lifted. "And should I care for their trust or for their lives?" A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, though it was more dangerous than warm. Sometimes the two are the same. Before she could answer, a group of fishermen passed, nodding to Nikolai with quiet respect, but casting wary looks at her. One muttered under his breath, too low for her to catch, and they moved on. Katya felt the weight of Nikolai's silence. He studied her like a puzzle, like a storm he hadn't yet decided to chase or avoid. Then, with a shrug, he pushed off the post. "Be careful, Doctor," he said, his gaze lingering a moment longer. "The sea here doesn't forgive mistakes. Neither do the people." And with that, he walked back towards the pier, leaving Katya standing in the cold morning light, unsettled but unwilling to be cowed. Night fell over Berezhny with little warning. The sea had turned black, a rolling shadow under the weak moonlight. The wind carried the salt and the chill of coming winter, rattling shutters and tugging at the edges of Katya's coat as she walked the narrow streets back from her last visit of the day. Her satchel was heavier now, filled with notes, remedies, and the faint, lingering smell of sickness. The village seemed quieter than it had in the morning, but Katya knew better than to trust silence. Every shadow was long, every whisper of the wind suspicious. She had learned that already. As she passed the pier, a flicker of movement caught her eye. Two figures emerged from behind a stack of crates, moving quickly, voices low and urgent. One carried a sack that thumped heavily with each step. Curiosity and something deeper, something dangerous, pulled her closer. She crouched behind a barrel, careful not to make a sound. The taller figure was Nikolai. The other, a stranger she didn't recognize, moved with the same quiet efficiency, eyes scanning the pier, as if expecting someone to follow. "Tonight," Nikolai said, voice barely above a whisper, "we move before the tide changes. No mistakes." The stranger nodded, shifting the sack. "The guards won't notice, not if we're careful." Katya's heart hammered in her chest. She hadn't expected this. Smuggling, right here, under the villagers' noses, and Nikolai, the man who had watched her so intently, was in the middle of it. Her mind raced. What should she do? Step forward and reveal herself, or retreat and risk being seen anyway? She stayed hidden, listening. Nikolai's gaze flicked toward the village again. The town comes first, always. If anyone interferes, his words trailed off, a warning that needed no ending. The stranger moved away, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Nikolai alone. He lingered for a moment, scanning the pier. Then his eyes found hers, bright, sharp, impossible to hide. Katya froze. Her presence should have been obvious, and yet he said nothing, just tilted his head, a faint, knowing smile on his lips. Finally, he spoke, low and measured. "You should not be here. I'm just walking," Katya said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Curiosity can get people killed, and sometimes it gets people involved in things they don't understand." Katya swallowed. She wanted to argue, to claim her right to help and to observe, but the weight in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't just warning her, he was testing her, seeing if she belonged in this world or if she would break under it. Then, without another word, Nikolai disappeared into the shadows, leaving Katya alone at the edge of the pier, the sound of the dark sea pounding against the wood beneath her. She stood there for a long moment, mind racing. She had come to study sickness and healing. She had not come to enter a world of secrets, danger, and smuggling. And yet, somehow, she already felt pulled in. The wind carried a whisper of salt and danger, and Katya realized, in Berezhny, nothing was simple. The following morning, Berejny was cloaked in mist. The sea, hidden behind a wall of gray fog, growled like a restless animal, waves crashing unseen. Katya woke early, her sleep broken by thoughts she couldn't silence. The image of Nikolai on the pier, his voice low, his words sharp, his secrets so close she could almost touch them, lingered in her mind like smoke. But she was a doctor, not a spy. That's what she told herself as she tied her scarf and stepped out into the damp street. The truth was harder. She had seen too much already, and the line between healer and witness was blurring. She carried her satchel through the lanes, stopping at cottages where the sick lay waiting. Children burned with fever, elders coughed with lungs scarred from salt air and labor. Katya moved from bed to bed with steady hands, yet she could feel eyes watching her, always watching. In one house, an old man refused to let her enter. He spat on the ground and muttered, "You bring nothing but trouble. We've lived with sickness before, and will live with it again." Katya forced herself to keep walking, jaw tight, though the sting of his words cut deep. She was here to help. Why couldn't they see it? Later, in the square, she overheard two women talking in hushed tones, their baskets of fish heavy on their arms. Don't trust her. Outsiders always bring questions, and questions bring soldiers. She turned away before they noticed her listening, but her chest burned with frustration. Was this what Nikolai had meant? That here trust mattered more than skill? As she rounded the corner of the lane, she stopped abruptly. There he was, Nikolai Sokolov, standing with two fishermen by the pier, his voice low but firm. Even at a distance, she could see the way the men deferred to him, the way their bodies leaned toward his, waiting for orders. She watched for a moment too long. One of the fishermen noticed her and murmured something under his breath. Nikolai's eyes lifted, finding hers instantly, and for a moment she swore there was a challenge in them. He excused himself from the group and crossed the street, boots striking the cobblestones with measured weight. "You follow shadows, doctor," he said quietly, stopping just close enough that only she could hear him. His eyes flicked over her face, unreadable, sharp. "Do you always walk where you're not wanted?" Katya held his gaze, refusing to back down. "If healing people means walking where I'm not wanted, then yes." A faint smirk touched his lips, though it was gone as quickly as it came. "Careful! In this town, curiosity and kindness look the same to most people. Dangerous." Before she could reply, he turned back to the men waiting for him, leaving her rooted to the spot, her heart pounding faster than she wanted to admit. The fog shifted, swallowing his figure into its gray curtain, and Katya realized something unsettling. It wasn't just the town that mistrusted her. It was her own instincts. Because every time she told herself to keep her distance from Nikolai Sokolov, her curiosity only grew stronger. The day ended in chaos. A boy had been dragged ashore, half drowned, after a boat overturned in the surf. The villagers gathered in panic, shouting, crossing themselves, helpless. Katya pushed through the crowd, her satchel bouncing against her hip. "Move! Let me through!" The boy lay on the pier, lips blue, chest barely moving. Katya dropped to her knees, hands already working, pressing against his chest, forcing air into his lungs. The crowd gasped at her strange methods, whispers hissing like wind through reeds. "Witchcraft," someone muttered. "She'll kill him." "Quiet!" The voice cut sharp through the noise. "Nikolai, He crouched beside her, his presence steady as stone, his broad frame blocking the jeers of the crowd. His hand brushed against hers as he steadied the boy's head. "Tell me what you need," he said. No hesitation, no doubt, just iron certainty. Katya didn't have time to think about the warmth of his hand brushing hers. "Hold him here. Keep his airway clear." Nikolai obeyed, his rough fisherman's hands precise under her direction. The boy coughed, choked, then spat a mouthful of seawater onto the planks. His chest rose with a ragged breath. The crowd exhaled as one. Relief rippled through them. But Katya barely noticed. She sat back, shoulders trembling with the release of tension. Nikolai's eyes found hers, close enough now that she could see the flecks of gray in them, like storm clouds breaking over the sea. His mouth curved in the faintest of smiles. The marketplace smelled of smoked fish and pine tar, voices carrying like restless crows across the frozen square. Katya pulled her shawl tighter as she moved through the stalls, every step heavy with watching eyes. She could feel it, the split in the village. Some nodded respectfully, whispering, "The healer," their faces full of quiet gratitude. Others turned away, muttering behind calloused hands, calling her Vedma, witch. Saving the boy had not erased suspicion, it had sharpened it. When she stopped at a honey seller's stall, a shadow fell across her shoulder. "You'll get cheated if you look that eager," came a low, amused voice. "Nikolai." "Of course." He leaned lazily against the stall, eyes glinting with that dangerous sort of calm. Without asking, he slid a coin across the counter and took the jar of honey, pressing it into her hands. "Sweet things for a sweet tongue," he said smoothly, lips quirking into the faintest smile. Katya glared, heat rushing to her cheeks. "Are you always this unbearable?" "Only when someone makes it too easy," he murmured back, standing just close enough that she caught the scent of tobacco and sea salt leather clinging to him. Before she could retort, an old woman shuffled forward, Babushka Anfisa, her scarf patched with age, her eyes startlingly sharp. She studied Katya with unnerving intensity. "Storms follow you," the old woman rasped. "Not just from the sky, child. Beware men who walk with shadows at their back." Nikolai gave a mocking bow. "Then she should avoid the whole village, Babushka." But Katya saw the flicker in his eyes, the smallest tightening of his jaw. He didn't laugh as easily as he pretended. That night, the village gathered in the hall for a feast, gratitude for the boy's survival, though vodka always found an excuse. Music rattled the beams, the stomp of boots and clap of hands filling the air. Katya stood uncertain at the edge of it all, until a familiar hand closed over hers. Nikolai. Again. He drew her onto the floor with effortless boldness, spinning her into the circle of dancers before she could protest. "I don't dance," she hissed under the music. "You're doing fine," he countered, his mouth so close to her ear it sent a shiver down her spine. And she did. The world blurred, heat, laughter, strings of the balalaika, and she found herself moving as though her body already knew the rhythm. Nikolai's grip was steady, confident, pulling her in, letting her go, pulling her back again. When the song ended, she was breathless, heart hammering. He didn't release her hand. "You see," he said softly, "even storms can be tamed for a while." But then another voice slid between them. "Well, well, the famous healer," a man said, stepping from the crowd with a wolfish grin. His coat was too fine for a fisherman, his smile too smooth. "Tell me, doctor," Sergei Morozov purred, "do you make it a habit to save children, or only when it wins you admirers?" Katya stiffened, but before she could speak, Nikolai pulled her closer, his arm sliding protectively or possessively around her waist. "She doesn't answer to you." His voice was low, cold, carrying just enough threat to still the laughter around them.
The feast continued, but the air had changed. Whispers spread like smoke. Sergei smiled, a predator, promising he'd be back for more. And Katya, still held close against Nikolai's chest, realized something dangerous. She wasn't entirely sure she wanted him to let go.
The storm broke over the town like a war drum. Sheets of rain battered the rooftops, and thunder rolled across the sea, masking the shouts of men converging near the storehouses. Nikolai led the way, his long coat whipping in the wind, Katya struggling to keep pace beside him. Lantern light flickered against slick cobblestones. Shadowy figures moved between the barrels and crates. Armed men loading contraband with practiced hands. The rival smugglers had chosen their moment well. Nikolai raised a hand to halt Katya, crouching low behind a stack of fishing nets. His jaw was set, his eyes narrowed with calculation. "Stay here," he murmured. "I'll draw them away." Before she could protest, he was already moving, slipping into the storm like a wolf into a flock. Within moments, the silence shattered. Shouts, gunfire, the splintering crack of wood. Katya pressed a hand to her chest, torn between fear and fury. Then she saw him, Nikolai, a dark figure against the rain, exchanging blows and firing quick shots that echoed over the docks. He fought like the sea itself, wild, relentless, but even wolves bleed. A gunshot rang out louder than the others. Nikolai staggered, his hand flying to his side, crimson blooming beneath his coat. "No!" Katya's voice broke through the chaos. She ran, heedless of bullets and shouting men, reaching him just as he fell to his knees. His breath came ragged, his face pale, but when his eyes found hers, a faint smile tugged at his lips. "Didn't I tell you," he rasped, "to stay inside?" Tears stung her eyes, but her hands were already working, pressing hard against the wound, feeling the hot spill of blood. "And let you die in the mud? Not a chance." Her voice trembled, but her grip was iron. The fighting raged around them, but in that circle of storm and blood, there was only the two of them. Nikolai's hand found her wrist, weak but insistent, his thumb brushing her skin as if to anchor himself to her. "Doctor," he whispered, half a groan, half a laugh, "if this is how you touch all your patients, I might start getting hurt more often." Katya choked out a laugh through her tears. "Shut up, Nikolai. Just hold on. You're not leaving me here." Bullets hissed into the night, men screamed and fell, but Katya had no ears for them. She tore fabric from her dress, binding his wound as best as she could, her body shielding him from the rain and chaos. And in that moment, with his blood warm against her hands and his gaze burning through the storm, she realized she wasn't saving a smuggler or a stranger. She was saving the man who had already carved himself into her heart. The storm had broken, but the night still carried its restless breath. Rain slid down the window panes of Katya's small lodging like tears that refused to stop. And the sea outside whispered in low, menacing tones, as if it had secrets yet to tell. Inside, the fire crackled weakly, throwing long shadows across the walls. Nikolai lay stretched out on her narrow bed, his shirt open and torn where she had cut away the fabric to clean the wound. The gash across his ribs was deep, angrier than she'd first feared, but he bore it with a crooked smile, as if pain were nothing more than another inconvenience of life at sea. "You should be resting, not smiling like a fool."
Katya scolded, dipping the cloth into warm water and pressing it gently against his skin. He winced, then chuckled under his breath. Resting is boring. Watching you fuss over me, though, now that's worth staying awake for. She shook her head, fighting back the unwanted warmth that crept into her cheeks. You risk your life, you bleed all over my floor, and you still think this is the time for jokes? His gaze softened, though mischief lingered in his eyes. If I don't joke, I'll start groaning, and then you'll think I'm weak. Can't have that, can I? You are weak, she said firmly, though her voice betrayed a tremor. Her hand lingered against his side a moment longer than it needed to. She could feel the heat of his body, the steady thrum of his heart under her fingers. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the rhythmic sound of rain. Katya busied herself with the bandages, wrapping his ribs carefully, but every brush of her hand against him sent a strange current up her arm. She hated the way it unsettled her, and yet she couldn't pull away. You have very gentle hands, Nikolai murmured. She glanced up, meeting his eyes. I'm a doctor. They're supposed to be gentle. No, he said, his voice low and certain. They're not just gentle. They're kind, strong, like you. The words hit her harder than she expected. She had been called clever, serious, even stubborn, but never kind. Her throat tightened, and she looked away quickly, focusing on tying the knot in the bandage. You should sleep, she whispered. He tilted his head, watching her with a half smile. And if I can't? Then close your eyes and pretend. His grin widened. Will you sing me a lullaby, doctor? Don't push your luck. He laughed, then winced again as the movement tugged at his ribs. Instinctively, Katya steadied him with her hand, pressing lightly against his chest. For a moment, neither moved. His breath caught under her palm, and she realized how dangerously close they were, how little space separated her from him. The fire popped in the hearth, and the shadows seemed to draw closer, as if the entire world leaned in, waiting. Katya, Nikolai said softly. Her name on his lips sent a shiver down her spine. She dared to meet his eyes again, and what she found there made her pulse quicken. Not just mischief now, but something raw, vulnerable, and impossibly earnest. Yes? She whispered.
He searched her face as though afraid the moment would vanish if he blinked. Then, with a quiet, almost boyish smile, he asked, Can I kiss you? The question hung in the air like the last note of a song. For a heartbeat, Katya forgot how to breathe. No man had ever asked her that before, not so directly, not so tenderly. Her lips parted, but words failed her. The safe answer would be no, the logical one certainly. He was a smuggler, a man of shadows and danger, everything she should avoid. And yet, here he was, hurt because he had chosen to protect others. Here he was, letting her see a side of him no one else in the town ever would. Instead of speaking, she found herself leaning closer, her hand still against his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. His eyes never left hers. If you're going to faint, I'll catch you, he teased, voice husky. That broke the tension just enough for her to let out a nervous laugh. You can barely sit up. Don't make promises you can't keep. His grin widened, but he didn't press. He simply waited,
as though willing to let her choose. Katya swallowed, her heart hammering. Finally, she whispered, yes. The word was so quiet it could have been mistaken for the sigh of the storm outside, but Nikolai heard it. His smile softened, and he lifted his hand with careful slowness, brushing his fingers against her jaw. When his lips finally met hers, it wasn't the wild, reckless kiss she'd imagined. It was slow, almost reverent, a question asked and answered in silence. The taste of salt lingered. Sea air, blood, tears. She couldn't tell. All she knew was that the world outside the room ceased to exist. When they parted, she kept her forehead against his, her breath unsteady. He let out a shaky laugh, whispering, "Worth the wound." She gave him a sharp look, though her lips curved despite herself. "You're dangerous, Katya Belova. Far more dangerous than smugglers or storms." The fire crackled, the storm raged beyond the walls, but inside, something fragile and undeniable had begun. A promise wrapped in a kiss. The next morning, Katya woke to the crash of waves and the low murmur of voices outside Nikolai's small house. She slipped from the cot and wrapped herself in her shawl, stepping to the window. Down on the shore, a cluster of fishermen stood in a tight circle, their faces pale. Nikolai was already outside, his arms still bound, but his stance sharp and alert. His presence alone seemed to anchor the group. When she joined them, the men fell silent, their eyes flicking to Nikolai. He gave her a brief nod, then gestured to the horizon. Far out, a ship drifted, too still, too quiet. "A signal," Nikolai said, voice low. "They're here, the rival smugglers." Katya's stomach tightened. What did they want? To remind us who owns these waters. His jaw set, and to test whether I'm still strong enough to stop them. One of the older fishermen, Yuri, stepped forward, his hands trembling. "They've already taken 2 boats this week. If they come ashore, our families, our children." Nikolai raised his hand. "I know. That's why we have to act tonight, before they grow bolder." Katya heard the iron certainty in his voice, but also the strain beneath it. He was hurt. He shouldn't even be standing so firmly, let alone planning another confrontation. And yet here he was, carrying the weight of the entire town. "You can't," she blurted before she could stop herself. All eyes turned to her, but she pressed on. "You can barely move your arm. If you go out there, you'll die." Nikolai's gaze locked with hers, and for a moment, the group around them faded. His voice softened, just for her. "Katya, if I don't go, they'll come here, straight to the people I swore to protect." Her throat tightened, but she held his stare. "Then let me help you, not just as a doctor." She swallowed hard. "Tell me what I can do." For the first time that morning, something flickered in his eyes, a mixture of pride and worry. "You're brave," he murmured, almost to himself. Then louder, "If we're to have a chance, we'll need more than courage. We'll need information." That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, they moved quietly along the shore. Katya followed Nikolai, her steps sinking into the wet sand. Every creak of the tide made her heart hammer faster. They weren't alone. 2 trusted fishermen flanked them, carrying lanterns hooded against the dark. The rival ship loomed in the distance, its silhouette broken only by the faint glow of a deck fire. As they drew closer, voices drifted across the water, harsh, foreign, dangerous. Nikolai crouched low, motioning for silence. Katya knelt beside him, close enough to hear his ragged breathing. He was pushing himself too hard, but he wouldn't stop. Through the night haze, They watched as smugglers unloaded crates onto hidden skiffs. Weapons glinted in the firelight, not just trade goods, but rifles. Katya's blood ran cold. They're preparing for something bigger, not just stealing, an attack. Nikolai's hand tightened on his knee. Exactly. His eyes hardened. If we don't stop them tonight, tomorrow they'll strike at the town. Before she could reply, a shout split the air. One of the rival smugglers had spotted movement along the shore. "Run!" Nikolai hissed, shoving Katya back. Lantern light flared as shadows leapt from the enemy's skiff, sprinting toward them. The fisherman bolted, but Katya stumbled, the sand dragging at her boots. Nikolai caught her wrist with his good hand, hauling her upright, even as pain twisted his face. They sprinted into the darkness, chased by the sound of pounding footsteps and the crack of a rifle shot, splitting the night. For the first time since she'd arrived in the town, Katya realized this wasn't just about medicine or duty or even the slow-burning pull between them. This was war, and they were already in the middle of it.
The storm had passed, leaving behind a town battered but alive. Smoke drifted from repaired chimneys, nets hung to dry across the docks, and fishermen moved like shadows between half-sunken boats, still weary but stubbornly alive. The Black Sea lapped gently at the shore, oblivious to the chaos it had carried just nights before. Katya moved carefully across the dunes toward the pier, her boots leaving soft impressions in the sand. Her medical bag hung loosely at her side, but it felt less important now than the quiet she needed. The town was healing, but so much had changed, not least her own heart. Nikolai limped down the beach toward her, shoulders still bandaged, eyes narrowed from the effort. Even weakened, there was no mistaking him. Strong, dangerous, impossible, and entirely familiar now, as if he belonged in the space beside her. "You should be resting, Doctor," Katya said softly, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "You first, Doctor," he replied, easing himself onto the sand beside her. He winced, but didn't complain. "I hear you stitched half the town. At this rate, they'll carve your name on the church wall before mine." Her lips curved faintly, though she kept her gaze fixed on the horizon. A strange legacy, being remembered for needles and bandages. "Not strange," he murmured, his voice low, carrying over the surf. "You gave them hope when they were ready to give it up. That's rarer than any fisherman's catch." They fell silent, listening to the waves. Silence felt natural, comfortable, the way it only could be between two people who had faced death side by side. Katya finally spoke, her voice barely above the whisper of the tide. "I thought I came here to study disease, to understand coastal illnesses, but what I found people surviving against impossible odds, and I found you." Nikolai's eyes softened. He brushed a hand against hers, small, deliberate, careful. "We survived," he murmured, voice roughened by both past wounds and exhaustion. She let her hand remain in his, feeling the warmth, the steadiness, and the quiet reassurance of him. No words needed to confirm it. Their closeness, the way he lingered, the gentle brush of his fingers against hers, it said more than any declaration could. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting copper-gold reflections across the Black Sea. The glow caught in Nikolai's eyes, and for a long moment
They just watched the waves, letting the world shrink to the two of them. Katya leaned slightly closer, allowing herself the comfort of proximity. Nikolai's shoulder pressed gently against hers, an unspoken promise of protection and presence. The subtle warmth between them, the shared history of storms, blood, and nights spent in fear, was enough. It was enough to make the air thick with unspoken understanding. He turned his head just enough so their foreheads nearly touched. She felt the faint brush of his breath on her skin. Soft, grounding. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet intimacy of it settle over her like a shield. "They'll rebuild," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "The town, the boats, the people. They'll rebuild," he echoed, tightening his grip on her hand ever so slightly. Katya's gaze flicked toward him, just for a heartbeat. The corners of his mouth curved in that stubborn smirk, but there was softness too, the kind that only emerges after a shared storm, after near death, after trust carved in blood. The waves whispered against the sand, rhythmic and persistent. Katya let her head rest lightly near her shoulder, and Nikolai shifted slightly closer so the space between them was minimal, almost nothing. Neither moved away, neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. The town moved around them, rebuilding and mending, while they remained on the dunes, quiet witnesses to each other's presence. When he finally glanced at her, there was no need for explanations, no declaration. The connection was clear: shared glances, gentle touches, lingering proximity, enough to speak louder than any words ever could. As the last light of the sun faded, Katya felt a calm settle over her, the kind that comes only when danger has passed and the one person you trust most remains by your side. Nikolai exhaled softly, letting the tension of the past nights fall away, his hand still lightly over hers. Together, they watched the horizon. Together, they survived. Together, they simply existed in a way that made everything else, the smuggling, the storms, the dangers, feel distant. And in that subtle closeness, Katya realized that while words hadn't been said, actions had already declared it. They belonged to each other. Not loudly, not with pronouncements, just quietly, firmly, and undeniably. The Black Sea stretched before them, vast and endless, and somewhere in its depths, the storms of the past seemed to soften. The future was unknown, but here and now, on the sand, with the waves whispering at their feet, they had found a harbor, one they would navigate together, in silence and in understanding, wherever the tides might take them.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what's coming next. Want to see the continuation of this story? Comment below and let us know what you think. Your opinion makes all the difference.